3 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order if there are no objections. And first thing I want to do is read a little paragraph about our technical procedure this afternoon, and then after that we'll go to the roll call. As a way of ensuring that our meeting goes smoothly, Tim, Paul, and Thomas, the Roanoke Valley-Alleghany Regional Commission's outreach and communication specialist, will serve as the host for this meeting. Although there is a chat function in the WebEx, this is to be used only by Tim and anyone having technical problems, not to discuss or comment on anything relative to the meeting. For those board members connecting to the WebEx remotely and using computer or phone audio, you will be muted and must raise your hand. There's a little raise your hand symbol there on your screen in order to be recognized by the chair. Any board members simply dialing in by phone will not be muted, but must wait to be recognized by the chair in order to speak. As we mentioned earlier, there will be no video on this conference call. However, it is being recorded. And with that, we will move to the roll call, if you would, please, Wayne.
Yes. Miss Shannon Cox. Lanford. Am I muted? Tim, am I muted?
We can hear you.
I got you now.
Oh, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, Miss Shannon Cox, Mr. John Lanford. Are they muted as well? That's why they're not answering?
Yes, they will need to unmute themselves if I
Tim?
unmute. If I
Tim?
unmute everyone, hang on, sorry. If I unmute everyone, it'll be too loud. So each person will need to unmute themselves when they're replying to the roll call.
Okay. Mr. John Lanford, Miss Joan Vanisdahl,
Present.
Mr. Steve Clinton, Miss Erin Henderson, Mr. Gary LaRue, Mr. Billy Martin, Mr. Dan Collins, Mr. Jesse Spence, Mr. Ronald Martin, Mr. Mike Carter, Mr. David Phelps.
Present.
Miss Lori Smith, Mr. Chris Whitlow.
Present.
Mr. Dan O'Donnell, Mr. Kevin Hutchins, Mr. Dean Martin,
Present.
Mr. David Radford,
Here.
Mr. Phil North,
Here.
Mr. Lee Osborne, Miss Crystal Oinitis,
Present.
Mr. Alan Tucker,
Present.
Mr. Bill Bestpitch,
Present.
Dr. Elda Downey,
Present.
Mr. Joe Cobb,
Present.
Miss Juna Osborne, Mr. Frederick Gussler, Mr. Peter Velosin,
Present.
Miss Jane Johnson, Mr. James Martin, Miss Carolyn Minnix, Miss Melinda Payne, Miss Pam Marshall, Miss Darlene Burcham, Mr. James Irvin, Mr. Mark
I'm here,
Dugal.
Wayne.
Okay, Mary Brad Gross,
Here, present.
Mr. Barry Thompson.
Present.
We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, sir, very much.
This is Lee
Again,
Osborne. I'm present.
Okay, Lee. Thank you.
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. Again, I want to welcome everyone to our meeting this afternoon, and we appreciate your understanding concerning all the technological hoops we have to jump through these days. I do have a couple of things I need to read to make the meeting operate properly. This meeting is being held pursuant to the Code of Virginia, Section 2.2-3708, which allows a public body to meet by electronic means without a quorum of the public body physically assembled at one location when the governor has declared a state of emergency, provided that the catastrophic nature of the declared emergency makes it impractical or unsafe to assemble a quorum in a single location. And number two, the purpose of the meeting is to address the emergency. The purpose of this meeting is to address the state of emergency declared by Governor Northam on March 12th, pursuant to the Executive Order number 51, and that is regarding the COVID-19 pandemic disaster, and the supplemental Executive Order number 53, which was issued on March 23, 2020. The emergency will allow the Commission to consider actions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic disaster. The Commission Board will consider two actions today. The first item is to establish a written policy that will allow members to participate electronically in the regular meetings of the Commission. The proposed policy will not allow the Board to meet for regular meetings due to the current states of emergency in the Commonwealth and our localities, but it is a necessary first step, hence the need for the second item. The second item is a resolution adopting procedures for electronic meetings and hearings, which will ensure the continuity of government during the COVID-19 pandemic disaster. Following the adoption of both items, the board will be allowed to hold electronic meetings without a quorum present in one location to discuss and conduct regular business. Once the emergency ordinance expires, meetings will utilize the electronic meeting policy for non-emergency purposes. For each of the two items we will consider today, staff will make a presentation and read the proposed resolution into the record. This will immediately be followed by the board decision and consideration of the item. Pardon me, that would be the board discussion. A roll call vote will be conducted. And of course, after that, we will adjourn the meeting. So with that, we will move to the first item. And I understand that Mr. Brian Hill is going to bring us some information on that.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. The first item is an action establishing a written policy authorizing the participation in Roanoke Valley-Alleghany Regional Commission meetings via electronic communication means. And as the chair mentioned in his remarks just a minute ago, on March 12th, we all know that the governor issued the Executive Order 51 declaring the state of emergency. The Virginia Emergency Operations Plan was then activated, and that allowed for, to quote, the needed framework within which more detailed emergency plans and procedures can be developed and maintained by state agencies, local governments, and other organizations. And that's quoting the Code of Virginia 44-146.17, number 1. As a result, the localities have in turn declared states of emergency, and their emergency operations directors have been operating under under those local states of emergency. Section 2.2-3708.2A3, as the chair has mentioned earlier, allows for us to meet today under an emergency situation without a quorum physically located in one location. And we're addressing the purpose of the emergency today by these items we're discussing. And although the meeting meets the code requirements to maintain continuity of government and to hold regular meetings, as it were, where normal business is discussed, staff recommends establishing a written policy to conduct electronic meetings. And this is a step one of a step two process. And for those local government elected officials, you all have been through this process as you have adopted your electronic communication means policies and subsequently your emergency ordinances. The Regional Commission Board is a regional public body of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and as such, the members are enabled by the Virginia Freedom of Information Act to, through 2.2-3708.2, to participate in meetings electronically and remotely under certain situations. In the attached resolution, staff recommends the following policy and adoption of the policy, and that follows in your packet. And Mr. Chair, I will, with your permission, I will read that resolution into the record.
Yes, sir, please.
The 23rd day of April 2020. Resolution: establishment of a written policy authorizing participation in Roanoke Valley-Alleghany Regional Commission meetings through electronic communication means. Whereas Virginia Code Section 2.2-3708.2 allows members of regional public bodies to participate in a meeting through electronic communication means from a remote location in certain situations, and whereas Virginia Code Section 2.2-3708.2A1B limits the number of meetings at which a member of the regional public body may participate by electronic communication means to 2 in each calendar year, and whereas on March 12, 2020, Governor Ralph S. Northam declared a state of emergency throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic disaster. And now, therefore, be it resolved by the Roanoke Valley-Alleghany Regional Commission Board, Commission, as follows. Number 1, the following policy is established for remote electronic participation in all meetings of the Commission. And that policy is as follows. A, on or before the day of a meeting, the member shall notify the chair that the member is unable to attend the meeting due to 1, a temporary or permanent disability or other medical condition that prevents the member's physical attendance, or 2, an emergency or personal matter and identifies with specificity the nature of this personal matter. Participation by a member pursuant to this subdivision is limited each calendar year to 2 meetings. B, as set forth in Virginia Code Section 2.2-3708.2 B1, on or before the day of a meeting, the member shall notify the chair that member's principal residence is more than 60 miles from the meeting location identified in the required notice for such meeting. C, except as provided in Section 2.2-3708.2 A3, a quorum of the Commission must be physically assembled at the primary or central meeting location. The Commission members present must approve the participation. However, the decision shall be based solely on the criteria in this resolution, without regard to the identity of the member or matters that will be considered or voted on during the meeting. The Secretary shall record in the Commission's minutes the specific nature of the emergency, personal matter or disability, and the remote location from which the absent member participated. If the absent member's remote participation is disapproved because such participation would violate this policy, such disapproval shall be recorded in the Commission's minutes. D, participation by the absent member shall be limited in each calendar year to 2 meetings of the Commission based on a specified personal reason set forth in Virginia Code Section 2.2-3708.2 A1B. Members shall not otherwise be limited except as set forth expressly in state code. E, The commission shall make arrangements for the voice of the absent member to be heard by all persons in attendance at the meeting location. F, with respect to meetings by electronic communications without a quorum present when the governor has declared a state of emergency, the commission shall comply with the provisions of section 2.2-3708.2A3. And then item number 2, this resolution shall take effect upon adoption. And Mr. Chair, to sort of end that, staff recommends adoption of the resolution, creating an electronic meetings policy.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. We appreciate that. Commission members, you have before you the resolution that would establish the written policy as you've read into the record and described by Mr. Hill. Is there a motion for adoption?
This is Bill Bestfitch. I move adoption.
Thank you, Bill. Is there a
Second, Lee
second?
Osborne.
Thank you, Lee. So I don't know exactly how we're going to take this vote. Can we just unmute and everyone in favor signify by saying aye?
Well, no, we have to have a roll call vote,
Will
Mr.
we?
Chairman.
Okay. All right.
And what we can do, I think Tim is going to try to unmute people, or they will unmute themselves when it's time to.
Have that procedure or not? What
I have unmuted everyone that is on a.
What does Brian and Wayne say?
I have. Go ahead.
But we have to have, Mr. Osborne, we have to have a roll call vote on these two resolutions.
Okay.
I think that's what the chairman was asking.
Yeah, exactly. And Wayne, so are you going to read the roll at this time?
Yes, sir. Ms. Shannon Cox, Mr. John Lanford.
Yes.
Ms. Joan Vandersdaal,
Yes.
Mr. Steve Clinton, Miss Erin Henderson, Mr. Gary LaRue,
Yes.
Mr. Billy Martin.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Dan Collins, Mr. Jesse Spence, Mr. Ronald Martin, Mr. Mike Carter, Mr. David Phelps,
Yes.
Miss Lori Smith, Mr. Chris Whitlow,
Yes.
Mr. Dan O'Donnell, Mr. O'Donnell, Mr. Kevin Hutchins, Mr. Dean Martin,
Yes.
Mr. David Radford,
I agree. Yes.
Mr. Phil North,
Yes.
Mr. Lee Osborne,
Yes.
Ms. Crystal Onitis.
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Alan Tucker,
Yes.
Mr. Bill Bestfitch,
Yes.
Dr. Elba Senko Downey,
Yes.
Mr. Joe Cobb,
Yes.
Ms. Juna Osborne, Mr. Frederick Gussler, Mr. Gussler, okay. Mr. Peter Velosin,
Yes.
Ms. Jane Johnson, Mr. James Martin, Ms. Carolyn Minix, Ms. Belinda Payne, Ms. Pam Marshall, Ms. Darlene Bertram, Mr. James Irwin,
Yes.
Mr. Mark Newbold, Mayor Brad Gross,
Yes.
Mr. Barry Thompson.
Yes.
The resolution passes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Commission. And with that, we will move on to our second item and understand that Mr. Hill is also going to make the presentation for that. Brian?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Item number 3 is an action to authorize the adoption of procedures for electronic public meetings, public hearings to ensure the continuity of government during the COVID-19 pandemic. As the commission just adopted their public policy on meetings, and we're holding this meeting as a result of the emergency meeting requirement in the code. Staff recommends adopting procedures for electronic public meetings and hearings. The policy limits the electronic participation of members whose physical residence is 60 miles or more from the primary meeting location. This results in very few members being able to participate, and going out on a limb and assuming here, I would say that there are just maybe 1 or 2 members that the body that this applies to, perhaps depending on where they live in the Highlands, possibly might get that 60-mile location. So that doesn't, for our purposes during the emergency, that certainly does not help matters. So in the past couple of weeks, as you all are well aware, many of you being elected officials from our localities, lots of the localities in the commission have adopted ordinances that make the temporary changes in certain deadlines, and they modify the public meeting and public hearing practices and procedures to address this very thing, the continuity of operations while we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic disaster. In each of the instances, there's a locality's emergency ordinance that recognizes the lack of safety in assembling a quorum in one location for public bodies, and allows regional public bodies to conduct meetings in accordance with normal practices and procedures. These ordinances are effective for 60 days per the Code of Virginia, unless they're amended, rescinded, or readopted. They cannot, at a maximum, last any longer than 6 months following the cessation of the disaster. And as I mentioned, a majority of our localities have adopted these ordinances, reflecting language that enables regional bodies to hold meetings without a quorum in the same location and to conduct regular meetings of regular business. And just to read an excerpt from the City of Roanoke's emergency ordinance, which has just insert your locality here. Essentially, this is found in most all of the emergency ordinances. All local regional boards, commissions, committees, and authorities created by the City Council or to which the City Council appoints all or a portion of its members, collectively public entities and individually public entity, or for such public entities to conduct meetings in accordance with normal practices and procedures. And we would anticipate that either all our localities have adopted these ordinances, or their local director of emergency management would allow such meetings. And since you're all aware that the physical location of our meetings is in the City of Roanoke, staff recommends adopting the continuity procedures as set forth in the City of Roanoke's emergency ordinance, which they adopted on March 27th of this year, and that is on page 11. And just as a summary of the requirements in the ordinance as follows, I'll read those. 1, declares the normal assembly of all public and regional bodies in one location unsafe. 2, any meeting or activities which require the physical presence of members of public entities may be held through real-time electronic means, including audio, telephone, video, or any other practical electronic media without a quorum physically present in one location. 3, prior to any electronic meeting, a public notice of at least 3 working days must be made identifying how the public can participate or provide comments. 4, the agenda shall state that the meeting is being held in compliance with the City of Roanoke's emergency ordinance. 5, all members must, during the meeting, be identified as being present electronically, and on the notice and agenda, opportunities for the public to have access to or participation in the meeting and must be identified, as well as any persons responsible for receiving public comments must be identified. And although this hasn't been adopted as of yet, we started that practice by Chair indicating that Tim Polly-Thomas was our moderator for today. Number 6, meetings are open to electronic participation, but closed to in-person public participation. 7, public hearing comments can be received by electronic means prior to the meeting and solicited through telephone or other electronic means during the meeting. All comments received before or during the meeting become part of the meeting record. 8, in addition to regular minute taking, they must indicate how the meeting was conducted, who participated, and the actions taken. The minutes can be approved at a subsequent electronic meeting, and all of any of these electronic meeting minutes that are taken under an emergency ordinance shall be ratified at a regular meeting following the end of the emergency. Number 9, any deadlines requiring action of a public entity, unless otherwise dictated by law, shall be superseded during the emergency and disaster. But the public entity and all staff are encouraged to take such action as is practical and to meet those deadlines. We fully understand that. At this point, Mr. Chair, I will read the resolution into the record, and the resolution does, as is attached directly behind it, have the city's emergency ordinance to it.
Yes, sir.
If you'll allow me to read that into the record.
Yes, sir, if you would, please.
The 23rd day of April 2020, resolution authorizing the adoption of procedures for electronic public meetings and public hearings to ensure the continuity of government during the COVID-19 pandemic disaster. Whereas on March 12, 2020, Governor Ralph S. Northam issued Executive Order 51 declaring a state of emergency for the Commonwealth of Virginia arising from the novel coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, and whereas Executive Order 51 acknowledged the existence of a public health emergency, which constitutes a disaster as defined by Virginia Code Section 44-146.16, arising from the public health threat presented by a communicable disease anticipated to spread, and whereas Executive Order 51 ordered implementation of the Commonwealth of Virginia Emergency Operations Plan, activation of the Virginia Emergency Operations Center to provide assistance to local governments, and authorization for executive branch agencies to waive, quote, any state requirement or regulation, end quote, as appropriate. And whereas on March 13th, 2020, the President of the United States declared a national emergency beginning March 1, 2020 in response to the spread of COVID-19, and whereas on March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic, and whereas on March 19th, whereas on March 16th, 2020, the Council of the City of Roanoke, Virginia, confirmed the declaration of local emergency made by Robert S. Cowell, Jr., City Manager and Local Director of Emergency Management on March 16th, 2020, specifically finding that the COVID-19 pandemic constitutes a, quote, disaster, end quote, as defined in Virginia Code Section 44-146.16, being a, quote, communicable disease of public health threat, end quote, and whereas Virginia Code Section 15.2-1413 provides that notwithstanding any contrary provision of law, a locality may, by ordinance, provide a method to ensure continuity of government in the event of a disaster for a period not to exceed 6 months. And whereas on March 27th, 2020, the Council of the City of Roanoke, Virginia, Council, pursuant to Virginia Code Section 15.2-1413, adopted an emergency ordinance to effectuate temporary changes in certain deadlines and to modify public meeting and public hearing practices and procedures to address continuity of operations associated with pandemic disaster emergency ordinance. And whereas through its emergency ordinance, the council specifically found that COVID-19 constitutes a real and substantial threat to public health and safety and constitutes a, quote, disaster, end quote, as defined by Virginia Code Section 44-146.16, being a, quote, communicable disease of public health threat, end quote. And whereas through its emergency ordinance, the council further found that the COVID-19 pandemic makes it unsafe to assemble in one location a quorum for public bodies, including the council, the school board, planning commission, and all local and regional boards, commissions, committees, and authorities created by the council or to which the council appoints all or a portion of its members, collectively public entities and individually public entity, or for such public entities to conduct meetings in accordance with normal practices and procedures. And whereas through its emergency ordinance, the council adopted certain procedures to ensure the continuity of government during the COVID-19 pandemic disaster, continuity procedures, suspended any deadlines applicable to public entities and their staff during the COVID-19 disaster, and authorized public entities at their discretion to postpone non-emergency public hearings and action items during the disaster. And whereas the Roanoke Valley-Alleghany Regional Commission, being a public body of which a portion of its members are appointed by council, is a public entity included within the scope of the emergency ordinance. Now therefore be it resolved that the Roanoke Valley-Alleghany Regional Commission hereby incorporates by reference and adopts the continuity procedures prescribed in the emergency ordinance, a copy of which is attached hereto, and be it further resolved that the Roanoke Valley-Alleghany Regional Commission hereby authorizes and directs its officers and staff to take all steps reasonably necessary or appropriate to implement such continuity procedures and to develop any specific procedures as applicable and appropriate for the Roanoke Valley-Alleghany Regional Commission, provided that such specific procedures are consistent with the terms and conditions of the emergency ordinance. And be it further resolved that this resolution shall take effect immediately upon adoption and shall remain in effect during the pendency of the emergency ordinance, including for all applicable period upon the readoption of the emergency ordinance by council.
Okay. All right, Brian, thank you very much. That's a lot of information. You did a great job there. Commission members, you have before you a resolution that would authorize the adoption of procedures for electronic public meetings and public hearings. Is there a motion?
Wayne, I move for approval and ask that you not poll for votes that for those members not marked as present.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all that. Would you say that again, please?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. I make a motion for adoption and do ask that when taking the roll call vote, we only ask for those who have been recorded as present so we could speed things along.
Oh, okay. Thank you, sir. And is there a second?
Second.
Mark Newman from Rocky Mount.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion, folks? Great. With that, Wayne, if you would please call the roll.
Yes. Mr. John Lanford.
Yes.
Ms. Joan Vandersall.
Yes.
Mr. Gary LaRue.
Yes.
Mr. Billy Martin.
Yes.
Mr. Carr, I don't know if Mike Carter they ever got on, but I don't think he's here. Mr. Phelps, David Phelps.
Yes.
Mr. Chris Whitlow.
Yes.
Mr. Dean Martin.
Yes.
Mr. David Radford.
Yes.
Mr. Phil North.
Yes.
Mr. Lee Osborne.
Yes.
Ms. Crystal Leonidas.
Yes.
Mr. Alan Tucker.
Yes.
Mr. Bill Bestpitch.
Yes.
Dr. Elder Stanko Downey,
Yes.
Mr. Joe Cobb,
Yes.
Mr. Juno Osborne. Ms. Osborne? Okay. Mr. Frederick Gussler? Mr. Gussler? Mr. Peter Velozin?
Yes, and Fred marked yes in the chat.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Ms. Pam Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. James Irvin?
Yes.
Mayor Brad Gross?
Yes.
Mr. Barry Thompson?
Yes.
The resolution passes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, sir, very much. And thank you, commission members, for your work this afternoon. I certainly want to thank you for your time this afternoon, too, by the way. And I must confess, I didn't think I would ever attend a commission meeting, sweatshirts and jeans and no shoes, but I have enjoyed it. I will say that. And if there is nothing of an urgent nature, we will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I make so moved. Adjourn.
Okay. We have a motion.
Who made the motion?
Bill North.
Okay, is there a second?
Second, Dave Phelps.
Thank you, David. All in favor? I think we can just either say bye, right? Say yes and goodbye. Thank you folks very much. I hope everyone is safe. Be
Thank you.
careful.
Thank you.
Be safe, everyone.
Be safe.